The author Toni Morrison once said, "No one ever talks about the moment that you found out that you were white or the moment that you found out you were black. That's a profound revelation. The minute you find out, something happens. You have to renegotiate everything." As a child, I understood that there was racial difference. I lived in a relatively diverse neighborhood, so I had friends of many racial and ethnic backgrounds. I could see that we looked different, and I sensed that there were other differences in culture and experience, but I couldn't articulate what those were. I also understood that people of color were the targets of racism, but my context for this was largely history, slavery, and the civil rights era. My earliest memory of awareness of racism centers on the Norman Rockwell painting entitled "The Problem We All Live With." It depicts Ruby Bridges, a 6-year-old black girl on her way to an all-white school during the era of desegregation. She's escorted by 4 deputy U.S. Marshals. Racial slurs are scrawled on the wall behind her, and there is a tomato that has been thrown against the wall. It almost looks like blood splatter. I remember the first time I saw this painting in person. I stood in front of it for a long time, taking it in. Ruby Bridges' experience was so different from my own experience as a white girl. I knew about difference and about the existence of racism, but I didn't realize what it meant for me to be white until I was a teenager, and my understanding continues to grow and deepen as I experience more of life. Think about your day-to-day experience. Is your racial identity apparent to you every day? Is there something that reminds you that you are white or black or indigenous or a person of color? Most of the people I know who are not white would say yes, absolutely. And most white people, on the other hand, go through our days without having to think about or worry about or be reminded of our whiteness. Awakening to our racial identity happens at many different stages of life. But as Toni Morrison says, the minute you find that out, something happens. You have to renegotiate everything. We have to renegotiate everything because our individual stories of racial identity unfold in the context of a much larger historical and cultural story about race. The something that happens is you realize the myth you've been socialized into. You realize the power of that illusion in your life and the lives of others and its real consequences, racism. Race itself is an illusion, a social construct that has shaped every one of us. The impact of this illusion, however, is real and powerful in that it dehumanizes us all. The 3-part documentary, Race, the Power of an Illusion, which our church's Racial Equity Task Force screened last fall, tells the story of the development of the concept of race. While people have been classified according to language, class, culture, and religion for thousands of years, the concept of race is only a few hundred years old. The context was the formation of the United States of America. What we learn in school is that this country was founded on the values of freedom and democracy. We also learn about slavery and the deep social inequalities that existed based on skin color and national origin. Many of our so-called founding fathers who promoted liberty and the rights of men were also slave owners. So how did they reconcile this? Well, they argued that these social inequalities were natural. Because the enslaved Africans were naturally inferior, they said, and the white slaveholders were naturally superior. There's something clearly different about these groups of people, they said. And so inalienable rights only apply to certain people. The supposedly natural difference between people was justified with pseudoscience which claimed that race is based in biological differences and traits like IQ and behavior, physical appearance, and even genetics. Of course, all of this has been proven false. Race is not biological. But let me be clear, I'm not suggesting that we embrace colorblindness, acting as if we don't see race or that the construct of race doesn't have consequences. Race has no biological basis, but racism is still real. This myth of the superiority of the white race justified not only slavery, but also the genocide of Native Americans, the internment of Asian immigrants, and the seizing of Mexican lands. It also became woven into our institutions, giving white people advantages, opportunities, and access to resources that people of color do not receive. It's even taken the form of laws that classify people of color as less than fully human. The US Constitution once classified Black Americans as 3/5 of a person. Their census value was only 60% of that of white Americans. Think about the impact of such a statement. Quantifying the level of humanity of a whole swath of the population, thereby dehumanizing and disenfranchising them. Today, racism takes real form in the almost daily occurrence of a Black person being shot and killed in their living room, during a traffic stop, while playing in a park, walking down their street eating a bag of Skittles. They are shot because the shooter has a story in their minds about this Black person, a story that comes with generations of institutional reinforcement. The story is that they are dangerous, violent, or aggressive, someone to be feared. And so in order to protect yourself, you have to shoot them. There's a message in there about the value of human life. I feel scared, so I am justified in shooting and killing another person. This is the thought process that happens in split seconds in the mind, which has deadly consequences. I imagine that this is the thought process that went through a police officer's mind in Columbus, Ohio on Tuesday, when they fatally shot a Black teenage girl, Ma'Khia Bryant, 4 times, just 30 minutes before the verdict was announced in the trial of another police officer, Derek Chauvin, charged with the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. None of us came up with this story on our own. It didn't begin with us. We're standing on the shoulders of generations who shared this story. It's many volumes long, volumes that are held in our minds and our bodies. Resmaa Menakem, author of My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies, calls this generational trauma, which both white people and people of color experience in different ways, a soul wound. The soul wound manifests when white people reflexively respond to the perceived threat of people of color with fight, flight, or freeze. The soul wound manifests when people of color enter a room and immediately look around them and over their shoulder, wondering who might be a danger to them. It manifests when a person of color receives a kind gesture from a white person and is suspicious of their friendliness. Our reading this morning from the novel The Heart is a Lonely Hunter is set in a southern mill town in the late 1930s. Dr. Benedict Mady Copeland, a Black doctor in town, is one of the main characters. He knows the sting of racism very well. Whether it's the cruel laughter of the patrons of the white restaurant he was dragged into, or his son Willie's experience of police brutality that led to both of his feet being amputated. He is weary, but he is hopeful, and he never gives up trying to protect and lift up the most vulnerable in society. Dr. Copeland befriends John Singer, a white man who is deaf and mute and works as an engraver at a local jewelry store. They share a deep commitment to justice and equity, and the story describes how Singer treats Dr. Copeland as an equal. In the reading, it is Singer who comes up and lights Dr. Copeland's cigarette. This is literally the first time that Dr. Copeland has experienced a courtesy like this from a white man. He wants to trust Singer's kindness, but because of his experience with racism over his lifetime, he was afraid to lose his dignity in friendliness. As Dr. Copeland knew in many situations where he tried to ignore blatant racism and walk on with dignity, it's not always socially acceptable to be angry. But how can we not be angry about the dehumanizing impacts of racism and the illusion that has been storied for hundreds of years about racial difference and white supremacy? When I first imagined this sermon, I asked myself the question, how do we live and build community together, knowing that race is a social construct, but racism is very real? I think part of the answer is that we have to make space for and witness this anger. Witness the anger, witness the stories, witness the trauma and the pain involved. Another part of the answer to how we live and build community together in the context of racism is deep humility. We must acknowledge that there's a lot that we don't know about others and that we haven't experienced ourselves. Yet we can listen to the stories of others and seek to work together to change things so that future generations don't grow up with these same stories that diminish or dismiss their inherent worth and dignity. The process of rewriting our stories of racial identity has multiple levels, one in the mind and one in the body. Our minds hold narratives of internalized superiority and inferiority, assumptions about rights and privileges, feelings of I'm greater or lesser than. The first step is finding those narratives inside yourself, and then seeking out learning opportunities that will help you to rewrite that narrative. Those learning opportunities could be workshops or book studies or discussion groups like the ones our Racial Equity Task Force is running right now. The body, though, is an often forgotten part of the anti-racist journey. As Ta-Nehisi Coates writes, all of our phrasing, race relations, racial chasm, racial justice, racial profiling, white privilege, even white supremacy, serves to obscure that racism is a visceral experience, that it dislodges brains, blocks airways, rips muscle, extracts organs, cracks bones, breaks teeth. You must always remember, he says, that the sociology, the history, the economics, the graphs and charts, the regressions all land with great violence upon the body. Resmaa Menakem, who came up with the term soul wound, points out that, quote, we've tried to teach our brains to think better about race, but white body supremacy doesn't live in our thinking brains. It lives and breathes in our bodies. Our bodies have a form of knowledge that is different from our cognitive brains. This knowledge is typically experienced, he said, as a felt sense of constriction or expansion, pain or ease, energy or numbness. Often this knowledge is stored in our bodies as wordless stories about what is safe and what is dangerous. So to upend the status quo and to truly change cultures and lives, we must begin with our bodies. Our bodies and the reflexive, trauma-fueled responses we have to one another. We must settle our bodies. Menakem offers a number of simple practices in his book, some specifically for people of color, some specifically for white people, some specifically for law enforcement, and some designed for all. that do just this. They help us reprogram the trauma responses in our bodies so we can relate to each other and to the world differently. He shares one of these healing practices during an On Being podcast with Krista Tippett, which I want to share with you now. It begins with you, wherever you are now. Sit for a second and stare straight ahead. As you're looking straight ahead, notice what is happening. What do you see in front of you? What's stationary and what's in motion? Notice your thoughts about my voice or about the music earlier in the service. Notice what's happening within and in front of you right now. Now look over your left shoulder. Use your neck and your hips to turn to look over your shoulder. And then come back to the center. Now look up and look down and come back to the center. And now turn to look over your right shoulder. Again, using your neck and your hips to turn. And now turn back to face forward. And sit there for a second and notice what is different. When he led Krista Tippett in this practice, she said, I feel more settled. There's a feeling of comfort. This is one of Menachem's simple practices for settling your body and orienting yourself to a space. It's an important part of rewriting the story in our bodies about race and racism, because so often there is a part of our bodies that is constricted saying, yeah, but what else is going to happen, or what's going to happen next? When you repeat this practice again and again, you feel more settled in your body and its surroundings, and space opens up for other things to happen, for a new story to be written. Children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they have never failed to imitate them, said James Baldwin. This is why our actions, what we do with our bodies, tells a story that can be carried on from generation to generation, unless we interrupt the story and do something different. We can't just tell stories of oppression over and over. We must also tell stories about resilience in the face of oppression, about white people resisting the narrative of how white people are supposed to be and claiming our role in working against racism. We must tell stories about compassion and about transformation. We need to tell these stories to move us forward into a different world, one where we are no longer bound by the illusion of race, and we are actively working to transform our world to eradicate the pervasive impacts of racism. Tell these stories to yourself and to your loved ones, and we'll begin the work of healing ourselves. Tell these stories in your community, to your neighbors, and we'll begin the work of restoring right relationship. Tell these stories in our church, and we'll begin the process of spiritual transformation and healing souls. Tell these stories to your elected officials, in the halls of power, in the boardrooms, and in the streets, and we'll begin the process of cultural and institutional change. May it be so. Amen.